But then official corruption does something else which has worldwide repercussions. The rising price of oil is only one example of how official corruption in the United States creates poverty around the world. There is another example. In this case, official corruption causes a rise in the wage gap. Now, what's the wage gap? The wage gap is defined as, or the wage gap is described as the relationship of worker productivity relative to his real wage. Productivity keeps rising in the United States and all over the world, but the real wage is lagging behind, is not rising as fast. In fact, in the United States, the real wage has been falling ever since the 1970s, while productivity keeps rising. In the rest of the world, the real wages are rising. India and China have seen some rise in wages, but productivity is rising much faster than the real wages. So the wage gap has been growing all over the world. What effect does it have? It has a really bad effect in every economy. What's the reason? The reason is productivity is the main source of supply. Wages are the main source of demand. If productivity rises very fast and wages don't, the end result will be an imbalance of supply versus demand. There will be overproduction in the economy because there is not enough demand to match supply. And overproduction means layoffs. Overproduction means rising unemployment and falling wages. So you cannot, no country can function smoothly with overproduction. So how do governments face this problem of overproduction? Well, if the economy were ethical, if there was fairness in the economy, then the government should follow policies that raise wages relative to productivity. If there is fairness, wages should rise in proportion to rising productivity, but the government is controlled by corrupt officials. So they don't want to raise wages, they don't even want to raise the minimum wage. So what they have done in the United States is they have tried to create new credit, new debt. New credit and new debt. When debt is created, that also raises demand, although artificially. You can raise demand either by raising wages or by creating new debt, and that's what the governments have done almost everywhere in the world, especially in the United States. The government has borrowed a lot of money, the government is in big debt by itself, then the government reduces interest rates, people then borrow money. People even mortgage their homes to borrow money to maintain their living standard, to maintain their lifestyle. So consumers in America are hugely in debt, the government is in debt, so they have tried to maintain the supply-demand balance by creating new debt. This is not a fair or ethical way to do it, but that's what they have done. Now, when you maintain supply-demand balance through increase in debt, what will be the result? The economy will function smoothly, but profits will rise sharply. Because wages are not rising, the fruit of increasing productivity will then go to profits, and when profits rise sharply, there will be stock market bubbles. There will be share bubbles in the United States, and since the United States is the center of the world economy, a bubble here will create bubbles elsewhere, so there will be share market bubbles all over the world, and that's why you can see why the Bombay Stock Exchange is in a fury, is in a mania by itself. Why stock markets are rising so fast in Shanghai and in London and even Japan. It's the US bubble that then creates bubbles all over the world. But these bubbles become very painful when they crash. Why do bubbles crash? Well, you know you need this new debt to maintain supply-demand balance. But debt cannot keep rising constantly. There is a limit to which debt can rise. A time comes when it cannot rise anymore. That's when supply is greater than demand, profits start to fall and bubbles crash. That's what has been happening since in the last 1 or 2 months. Share prices are falling all over the world. Why? Because credit is tight. See, new debt is not easy to create now, and therefore share markets are crumbling. But what's the main cause of first the bubble and then the crash? The main cause is the rise in the wage gap. And the rising wage gap reflects official corruption. Well, that's what happens in the United States. What about in other countries where wage gap is rising? Well, like China and Japan. In these countries, what they have done, they just simply maintain an artificially low exchange rate so that they can export their surplus production to the rest of the world. And that's why the United States has a huge trade deficit with Japan and China. Also, it has some deficit with India, because in India also there is a growing wage gap. But this shows these imbalances cannot last forever. Something has got to give. And unfortunately, that means there will be bigger problems in the near future. So again, you can see corruption creates poverty, creates wage gap, and then creates imbalances around the world, which can potentially be catastrophic. The wage gap was very high during the 1920s. The end result was a stock market crash all over the world and then a major depression. So again, now the wage gap is very high, and I'm afraid that we could have big problems in the economy in the near future. So what should we do? How should we eradicate poverty around the world? And that answer comes from my teacher's theory. Sri Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar has offered a theory called PROUT, and the major policy offered by PROUT is economic democracy. Economic democracy means the end of capitalism as we know it. But it's the beginning of prosperity for everybody and the masses. Economic democracy means that in large companies that exist in India and elsewhere, in large multinational firms existing in India and elsewhere, at least 51% of the shares are owned by employees themselves. The employees then elect board of governors. The CEO is also responsible to the employees. So in this kind of setup, when productivity goes up, wages will also rise in proportion. Wages will not fall, wages will not stay constant. Wages will go up as fast as productivity. The wage gap would not rise anymore. All the imbalances that I've talked about, all the poverty that I've talked about will then disappear. That's the main policy content of PROUT. I'm sure there are a lot of books available at the Prout Convention. After all, this is Prout Convention. You can read up on my teacher's theory. But the main thing is that it's economic democracy. That's the main policy weapon of PROUT that would eradicate poverty in the world. But of course, the question is, who will bring about this democracy?